My name is Lila Hassan, and I am 26 years old, and I want to tell you about my graduation day, the day I walked across a stage in front of 400 people with a diploma in my hands and a medical school acceptance letter in my apartment, and the 40 minutes at the reception dinner afterward that became the most important 40 minutes of my life. I need to start with what I had built before that day, because the building is what made the 40 minutes possible to survive and move past. I had grown up in a Middle Eastern American household in Houston, Texas, the oldest of 3 children, the first in my family to pursue medicine. My parents had come to the United States before I was born with the specific, determined hope of people who are building a future in a country that is not where they started, and who understand that the future has to be built rather than assumed. My father ran a small import business. My mother managed the household and the family social calendar and the extended family relationships that were the connective tissue of our community in Houston. The relationships built across years of celebrations and funerals and Friday dinners, and the specific intimacy of immigrant communities that understand each other's language and history, and the particular pressures of maintaining culture in a country that does not share it. I had been pre-med since my junior year of high school, not because my parents expected it. They had been cautiously supportive without fully believing I would complete the path, but because I had sat beside my grandmother in a hospital room when I was 12, during the illness that eventually took her, and had understood, in the way that 12-year-olds sometimes understand things with more clarity than they are given credit for, that the doctors and nurses in that room were doing the most important work available to a human being, and that I wanted to do it. 4 years of undergraduate work, organic chemistry and biochemistry, and anatomy, and the MCAT, and the specific exhausted focus of a pre-med student who is also navigating family expectations and cultural dynamics, and the particular challenge of being a first-generation college student in a program where most of her classmates had parents who were physicians and had grown up understanding what the path looked like. I graduated with a 3.84 GPA. I had a medical school acceptance letter from a program in Austin. I walked across that stage on a Saturday afternoon in May, and I believed completely that I was standing at the beginning of everything I had worked toward. I was right about that. I was just wrong about what the beginning was going to look like. The reception dinner was at a restaurant my parents had rented for the evening, 43 family members from Houston and 2 from Dallas who had driven in for the occasion, long tables with graduation balloons and a cake that said Dr. Lila in advance of the title I had not yet earned, which was the specific kind of proud parent move that I found both embarrassing and deeply moving. I sat at the center of the table in a navy dress I had bought for the occasion, and I felt, for the first 40 minutes of the dinner, exactly what I was supposed to feel, surrounded by people who loved me, celebrated, seen. My cousin Tariq was there. He was 28, my uncle's son, a man I had known my entire life in the casual way you know cousins at family gatherings. We had never had a meaningful conversation. We had never been close. He existed in my mental map of the family the way all cousins exist at events, present at tables, genial at tables, not someone I had ever thought about in any particular way. When my father stood up and tapped his glass, I assumed it was a toast. My father gave toasts at family events with the specific warmth of a man who loves an audience and who uses the occasion to say the things he means but might not say in private. I smiled and prepared to be embarrassed and moved in the way his toasts always made me. He said he and my uncle had something to share with the family. He said it with the specific warmth of a man who has organized a surprise and believes the surprise is a gift. He gestured to Tariq and to me. He said our families had been close for many years, and that he and my uncle had discussed and agreed that it was time for that closeness to become something more formal. He said that Lila and Tariq would be married by the end of the year.
The table erupted, relatives clapping, my aunts making the sound that my aunts make at celebrations, high and rhythmic, and full of warmth that was genuine and completely unrelated to what I was experiencing in my body at that moment. My mother was smiling and wiping her eyes and looking at me with an expression that told me she had known and been carrying the knowing. I looked at Tariq. He was looking at the floor with the specific expression of a man who had also not been asked. I smiled. It was the smile I had learned across 22 years of navigating family expectations, the smile that means I need more time before this conversation happens. I picked up my water glass. I looked at my father, who was beaming at the table. I said, "Baba, thank you," and I counted internally until I could excuse myself to the bathroom.
In the bathroom, I stood at the sink and looked at my reflection and gave myself exactly 3 minutes to have the feeling before I decided what I was going to do with it. The feeling was large, not primarily anger, though anger was present, primarily a specific variety of grief that comes when people you love reveal something true about themselves that you cannot unknow. My father had organized the most significant day of my academic life around an announcement that treated me as a variable in someone else's plan, rather than as the architect of my own future. My mother had known and had not told me. They had apparently spent months planning something that would affect the rest of my life without asking whether I wanted it. 3 minutes. Then I composed my face and went back to the table. I sat through the rest of the dinner with the smile in place. I received congratulations on the graduation and the engagement simultaneously from relatives who were treating them as equivalently wonderful news. I ate the food. I thanked people for coming. I cut the cake that said Dr. Layla and ate a piece and said it was delicious. When the dinner ended and we were in the parking lot and my father was arranging who was going where and my mother was collecting serving dishes, Tariq caught my elbow gently and said, "Can we talk for a second?" I said yes. We stood between 2 parked cars in the parking lot of the restaurant, and he said, "I did not know." I said, "I know you did not know." He said, "I want you to know that I am not going to tell anyone I disagree with my father and yours. That is not something I am able to do in front of everyone." He said, "But I also want you to know that whatever you decide, I will not make it harder for you." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I am sorry about today." I said, "Me too." We went back to our families and I drove home alone, and I sat at my kitchen table with my diploma and my medical school acceptance letter, and I made 3 calls. The first was to my best friend, Amara. I told her everything. She said exactly the thing I needed to hear, which was not advice and was not a plan, but was simply, "This is your life, Layla, not theirs, yours." She said it with the specific conviction of someone who knows you well enough to remind you of things you already know when you need reminding. The second call was to my academic advisor at the university, who had been my mentor across 4 years and who I called not for advice about the family situation, but to confirm my enrollment start date at the medical school, because I needed to hear the date said out loud by another person as a way of making it real. The third call was to the medical school's admissions office. I left a voicemail confirming my enrollment and my start date and the housing I had arranged. I said my name clearly. I said I was looking forward to beginning in August. Then I sat at the kitchen table and I made a list of everything I needed to say the following morning. I drove to my parents' house the next morning, Sunday. I arrived at 9, which was the time I knew my father would be awake and sitting with his coffee and that the house would be quiet before the day's obligations began. My mother was in the kitchen. She saw my face when I walked in and she put down what she was doing and she said, "Layla," not a question, my name as an acknowledgement of what the morning was going to contain. I sat at the kitchen table. My father came in from the other room. He had his coffee. He sat.
He looked at me with the specific expression of a man who believed the previous night had been a success and was prepared for gratitude rather than a conversation. I had the medical school acceptance letter on the table in front of me. I had placed it there deliberately because I needed both of them to see it during the conversation, to have a physical object in the room that represented what was actually at stake. I said, "I love you both. I want to say that first because everything else I say this morning is going to be hard, and I need you to know that the hard things are coming from the same place as the love." My father nodded. He thought he knew what was coming. He thought it was a conversation about timing. I said, "I am not going to marry Tariq." My father started to speak. I said, "Please let me finish." He waited. I said, "I am not going to marry anyone who I have not chosen myself, in my own time, based on my own understanding of who I am and what I need." I said, "I understand that what you and Uncle arranged came from love and from tradition and from a genuine belief that you were doing something good for our family. I am not questioning the intention. I am telling you clearly and for the first time without any ambiguity that the decision itself is not something I accept." My mother said, "Layla, in our family." I said, "I am your family." I said, "I am sitting at this table and I am 22 years old and I have worked for 4 years to earn a place in medical school, and I am asking you to see me as the person who did that work rather than as a variable in an arrangement that was made without asking me." My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You are going to embarrass us in front of your uncle." I said, "I am asking you not to make me choose between you and my future." I said, "I am hoping that is a choice you'll take back."
The conversation at the kitchen table lasted 2 hours. Not a clean 2 hours, not a resolution that arrived in a single morning. 2 hours of the most honest and painful talking my family had ever done at that table, which had hosted years of dinners and holidays, and the ordinary accumulation of a family life that had not included until that morning the kind of conversation where everyone had to be fully honest about what they actually believed and what they actually wanted. My father said things that revealed how he understood my life and my role in the family, things that were difficult to hear and that I received without interrupting because I had decided that this morning I was going to hear everything clearly rather than filtering it through the softening lens I had maintained for 22 years. My mother said things that surprised me, things that told me she had more reservations about the arrangement than she had allowed herself to express before the dinner. Reservations she had managed by deciding the arrangement was inevitable rather than examining whether it was right. I said what I had come to say, and I said it without anger and without apology and without the performance of negotiation. I was not negotiating. I was stating what was true about me and about my future and about what I was willing to do and what I was not. By the end of the 2 hours, my father had not agreed with me. I want to be honest about that, because the story that ends with parents immediately understanding and reversing course in a single morning is not the story I am telling. My father was a man with deep convictions about family and culture and the role those things played in individual decisions, and he did not set those convictions down in 2 hours. What he did was listen, completely, for the first time in my memory. He looked at the medical school letter while I talked about what I had worked toward, and he listened with the expression of a man who had having to hold 2 things at once that he had previously understood were in conflict. He said, "I did not know you felt this way." I said, "I know." I said, "I am telling you now." He called my uncle that afternoon. I was not in the room for that conversation. I do not know exactly what was said. What I know is that Tariq texted me that evening and said simply, "My father says the arrangement has been reconsidered. I hope medical school is everything you worked for." I wrote back, "Thank you, Tariq. I hope everything works out well for you."
My relationship with my parents in the months and years after that morning has been the most honest one we have ever had, because the conversation at the kitchen table established, for the first time clearly and without ambiguity, who I was and what I required from the people who loved me. That was not a small thing. That was everything. I started medical school in August. I am now in my third year. The work is harder than anything I have done, and more meaningful than I imagined, and I am exactly where I decided to be on the Sunday morning I drove to my parents' house and sat at the kitchen table with my medical school letter in front of me and said the truest things I had ever said to anyone who needed to hear them. My father came to my white coat ceremony. He sat in the auditorium and watched them put the coat on my shoulders, and he cried, which was the first time I had seen him cry in my memory, and I understood that the crying was not only pride, it was also the specific, complicated feeling of a man who had almost made a different kind of mourning, and who understood now, fully, what that mourning would have cost. After the ceremony, he held me and said, "You were right." I said, "I know, Baba." He said, "I am proud of you." I said, "I know that too." We are not a family that has resolved everything. We are a family that had one very honest morning and has been slowly building something more honest ever since, which is slower and more difficult and more real than any resolution I could have scripted. My name is Layla Hassan, and I am going to be a doctor. That is not something anyone arranged for me. That is something I chose. And the day I stood at a graduation dinner and heard someone else's plan for my life was the day I finally said clearly and without apology that my life belonged to me. It always had. It just took that dinner to make me say it out loud. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.